Today we are discussing the book The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way by Amanda Ripley. This is an excellent book. I truly believe if you read this book, you will have all the information you need to reform the American school system and make it number one. I truly believe if every politician and citizen of the United States read this book, we would be number one in education. Basically, Amanda Ripley followed 3 foreign exchange students from the U.S. to South Korea, Finland, and Poland to compare and contrast the American education system to the education system of those countries. So the author points out that, millions of kids are getting ripped off of an education every year. And they only find this out when they end up in college and have to take remedial classes. And it ends up costing them a lot of money and a lot of time for the failures of their high schools. So the author doesn't blame teachers union, but I personally do blame teachers union. So from my interpretation of what she was writing. So the reason she doesn't blame teachers union is because her rationale is that most every developed country has a teachers union that makes it close to impossible to fire teachers. Even Finland, which has the best system, that even South Koreans admire because there's a school-life balance. So even Finland has a strong teachers union. However, what I disagree with her on is the interpretation of that fact. So as she explains in the book, Finland rebooted their teacher system out of necessity to modernize and not be left behind. Because like Poland and Korea, Finland doesn't have much to offer in terms of natural resources other than their workforce. So they needed a strong workforce, so they rebooted their school system from the top to the bottom. Finland had a school reform where they made it super difficult to be a teacher in Finland. To be a teacher, you have to attend one of the top 3 schools in Finland. You need 3 teacher mentors, and you need to be on the top third of your class to be a teacher. I think she mentioned that becoming a teacher is as hard there as being a doctor. But also, of course, it's more prestigious because it's so difficult, and they get paid handsomely for it too there. So a worry that they had was that decreasing, making it more difficult to become a teacher would decrease the supply of teachers, and that might lead to a shortage of teachers. But because they in Finland already had a surplus of teachers, they didn't encounter a shortage or anything like that. And I think that's a very interesting thing because even in the United States, every year, America produces 2.5 times the number of teachers it needs. So I think if we have a strict reform, we don't have to worry about shortages. My interpretation is that here in America, the teachers union would never allow that kind of reform to happen in the first place. So yeah, on paper, Finland has a teachers union and America has a teachers union. But the difference is that somehow the teachers union in Finland allowed there to be such a strict gauntlet for becoming a teacher. Well, here in the United States, I don't think the teachers union would be happy with such strict reform on the teachers. I think personally, the emphasis on the teacher quality is all over the book. It came from a lot of different experts that she asked. And there's 2 different ways to come up with that, right? So one way would be from a top to bottom regulatory reform, right? How they did it in Finland. So maybe if you're a Democrat, you're okay with that, creating a law that just makes it, passing a law that from one moment to the next makes it more difficult to get a license to become a teacher. If you're a Republican and you don't like regulations, you might enjoy doing that same thing, but through deregulation. So privatizing everything, getting the market to sift through everything, and paying better teachers more, less teachers getting fired, the worst teachers getting fired, and you end up with the cream of the crop through that competition and death and rebirth. So a lot of people in the book emphasize the importance of teachers. There's an example even that in Norway, Norwegians complain about their teachers all the time, but they're right next to Finland. So what's the difference? Well, the difference is their teacher standards. But here's where it makes you angry Reading this, it's a very compelling book. I highly recommend it. You're reading it, and the author mentions how strict the Finnish school, the process is to become a teacher, and then she mentions the American way. So in the United States, you can become a teacher even if you score 18 points in your ACT score, which is lower than the national average on the ACT, which is 20.6 points. Let me repeat that. In the ACT, you can score less than the average and you can become a teacher in the United States. She repeated that in her book. She said, let me repeat this, and rephrased it because it's truly astounding and it makes me angry. In the United States, a math teacher doesn't need to major in math. They don't even need to minor in math. Reading this made me mad. In America, some students needed better academic standards to play football than to become a teacher. And she really does a good job juxtaposing one of the foreign exchange kids' foreign teachers in Finland with her local teacher in Oklahoma, who just became a math teacher to be a football coach. It makes you angry. It really makes you angry. As she says in the book, all the Finnish teachers need a master's degree, quote, which means something very different than what it does in the United States, end of quote. As she says in the book, a master's degree, in the United States, didn't make a teacher better at their job. In fact, some of the teachers indicated it made them worse. What she did blame, though, was that whenever a state or municipality or the country would try to have more rigorous standards for testing or more rigorous standards for schooling, politicians, parents, mayors, governors, etc. would predict failure and would fight it and fight it and fight it. She mentioned the example of Rhode Island, which is a really good excerpt. I really recommend it because you're reading what a disparity Finland has in their standards, in their teacher standards from America. And it makes you angry. And then you get to this part where she talks about how people fight it. They always fight it. So in Rhode Island, the education commissioner in Rhode Island wanted to raise testing minimum test scores for becoming a teacher. Now, at the time, Rhode Island allowed lower than the national average test scores to become a teacher. Immediately, critics called her elitists and brought up the same arguments they always do. Some argued that a bad teacher was better for kids because the bad teacher would, empathize and would know the problems that these kids struggle with. Some said it was racist and said that minority kids won't be able to become teachers. And some argued it would bring a teacher shortage. But they already had 800 surplus teachers than what Rhode Island needed. And they were predicting a shortage. I mean, obviously the fears never materialized in Rhode Island, but that was a very good point that she made in the book. And it kind of reminded me of when New Jersey or Oregon or something repealed a law forcing people to, get a pump jockey, So basically made everybody pump their own gas. And there was an outrage at that too. And meanwhile, they were think of the elderly, think of the handicapped. They're going to have to pump their own gas. And it's the 48 other states are what? What are you freaking out about? She also dispelled a lot of myths regarding teachers. For example, the question of teachers' salary. She mentioned that the world's highest paid teachers live in Spain, where kids actually perform worse than the U.S. and Finland. She also mentioned, quality over quantity. How strangely it just seems like classroom sizes don't matter too much. There's a lot of poorer countries with class sizes much bigger that are outperforming the United States in math and reading. In terms of salary, my personal opinion, which I guess is kind of deviating from the book, the discussion we're having about the book, but my personal experience is, teacher's salary, okay, there's no such thing, what John Stossel quoted in his book, No They Can't, there's no such thing as prices being too expensive or too cheap. You see, prices are information, and the information they give you is how is supply relative to demand. Now, we say that teachers are underpaid. Okay, for what? Rehearsing the same lesson they do every single year? They're underpaid. But you have to realize we have a surplus. We have a tremendous surplus of teachers. So if a teacher thinks they're not making enough, okay, somebody will just replace them because there's so many teachers, such a high supply. So that demand is huge. And also, we're not really adjusting when we talk about teacher salaries. We're not really adjusting for the fact that how many hours they work. They get summers off. Like, that's a huge benefit. Of course, that's deviating from the book. None of that is talked about in the book. That's just my personal opinion. But I do think also that as a society, we have to realize, if we want to fix the education system in America, we have to realize if we really want to fix it. Do we really prioritize it? As I've said before, I truly believe we don't have teachers as strict as, for example, Finland. If we want to have a school system and improve it very rapidly, we would make the same changes that Finland did and just have very strict standards for teachers. But we don't want to do that in America because we care about teachers getting fired. Teachers vote. The teachers union is very powerful, and we end up prioritizing the teachers over the students, and our kids end up being dumb. So one very good part about the book is that she mentions South Korea, and one way that South Korea that evidently truly cares about education, truly prioritizes education over everything, including teachers. How South Korea circumvents and through the private market is able to, make up for the lacking of their public school system. Another part I liked in the book was how she described basically the embodiment of the free market solution to the education problem in South Korea. So in South Korea, they have basically the free market utopia of what a free market solution to education would be. This is in the form of the Hagwon, which is the after-school study place, right? A place where your kids can be tutored after school. People will walk around and will help your kids with their homework. Because of the hyper-competition, and I think the fact that Koreans prioritize education so much, you get these answers. And we do have it here in the United States too. We have, after-school help, but it's not as ubiquitous as in Korea because of our priorities are different. As the author puts it, a Hagwon has distilled the educational system into its smallest denominator, the teacher. You go to a Hagwon, there's going to be a teacher/tutor who will help you with your homework and will sometimes push you just as much as your regular school teacher. In fact, in Korea, you have millionaire teachers, but it's more of a Khan Academy kind of thing where the teacher sells educational books and tapes kind of a thing. But the Hagwons have a lot more freedom. According to her, poor people, from my recollection, poor people pay a lot of money to have their kids attend Hagwons. I think the number she mentioned was $10,000 a year was the cost. The survey she mentioned said that kids prefer their Hagwon teachers. Kids in Korea, they sleep in their public school lecture, and then they actually, stay awake for their Hagwon work. Mostly because they're exhausted too. It's not, I'm not trying to misinform either. But, Hagwon teachers, Koreans complain a lot about Hagwons. They're far from perfect, right? Hagwon teachers aren't all rich. They're not all millionaires. In fact, far from it. They work grueling conditions sometimes for sometimes bad pay. Koreans really complain about the Hagwons and have passed a lot of laws trying to limit the cost of Hagwons and the hours that kids can spend in a Hagwon. They also try to keep what are called libraries from becoming Hagwons. So a library is just a place where your kid will go do homework. A Hagwon is where your kid will go do homework and get help on their homework. So it's like a black market kind of thing where libraries are trying to charge more to become Hagwons. But because there's regulations, there's sting operations where it turns out that these quote-unquote librarians are actually trying to act as Hagwons and helping these kids with their homework, which is illegal because they're regulating Hagwons. But of course, the problem will always persist if the demand is there, right? Just because if you make something illegal doesn't mean that it's going to go away if the demand is still there. And to change the demand for Hagwons, as the author points out, they have to change Korean industry and society as a whole. In the US, everyone blames the parents And the schools can say that, oh, well, it's the parents' fault. How can we do anything if the parents aren't involved? Well, in the Korean Hagwons, they get the parents involved. And if the parent is not involved in the education, then it is viewed as the Hagwons' fault. They send the parents notifications on their phones, like, keeping them alert when the kid arrives, leaves, and so on. Everyone hates Hagwons in Korea because they, even the Koreans who are number 2 in the world, or arguably maybe number 1, who knows, even they know that there's no balance between, life, school balance in the kids. They know that they're overworking their kids, and they don't like their Hagwons. But, according to a Hagwon owner, so kind of biased, but according to one of the Hagwon owners, if it wasn't for Hagwons, Koreans' rankings would drop. They keep saying that Hagwons are a response to the failing of the public education system in Korea. A bunch of Korean people in Hagwons kept saying that. According to the education minister, or whoever it was that she interviewed, the reason Korea does so well is purely because of the children's efforts. The world ranking of Korea is being carried on their backs. It's a very, as the author put it, very inefficient system where kids are working themselves to death to be, have a pretty good ranking. But Finland does it more efficiently, where the kid doesn't have to work himself to death, him or herself to death. So I think the reason that is driving all the rankings is the fact that they prioritize, like, the reason why the rest of the world does better in math and science than the United States is because the United States doesn't really prioritize it that much. Because deep down, we know that we didn't end up using all the math stuff. It's not really applicable to the day-to-day, which is true. Even I went on in a STEM career, and even I didn't apply, I forgot most of the math I learned. But the rest of the world really prioritizes math and science because they know that in general, not necessarily, but in general, math and science jobs pay more. So that's why they stress it more. That's why I believe they do better in math and science than us. The U.S. is doing pretty well in reading because we really prioritize reading. According to the author, the United States is a farmer. It is an agrarian, like Thomas Jefferson wanted an agrarian country, and a lot of people say it didn't come true, but I truly believe it did come true to a huge extent. Like any state you go to, it's all surrounded by, the capital, the big cities are all metropolitan and stuff, but you go around them and it's all farms. And according to the author, our farmers in our country haven't modernized our views on what is needed. Math is no longer optional in the current global market. You need math to work at McDonald's. You need to express yourself. You need to be eloquent to some degree. So Finland has the best education system and got it from a dictum having stricter standards for teachers. South Korea, arguably also the best education system, but has a more inefficient strategy by overworking the kids with the Hagwons. The lesson I got from Poland was the merits of tracking. So in Poland, they had a radical change in their education system, and it showed an improvement where Poland caught up to the developing countries in a very short time. They had lots of different changes that are listed in the book, but this is the only one I'll be discussing because it was the most substantial in terms of results. Here's what I took from it. They looked at the data, and the biggest cause of improvement was getting rid of tracking. So tracking is when around the age of 15, kids are placed in different types of schools. Tracking is done by vocational schools or selecting kids to AP classes. That's also a form of tracking. Adding kids to special ed is a form of tracking. Community college credit programs. Anything that separates kids to their specific level is tracking by definition. So what they did was they delayed the tracking. So they delayed when they would split the dumb kids from the smart kids by 1 year. So for example, instead of kids at 15 going to vocational schools, they would go at 16. So these quote-unquote, dumb kids or whatever, instead of being sent to a vocational school where English and math weren't as emphasized as hard, as much, they would keep going to an academic school. This worked great, lifting them and lifting their math and science and reading scores, and lifting the national average. However, the bad thing is that as soon as they went back to their tracking, a year later, all their progress plummeted. So by 16, all the benefits had disappeared. And it makes logical sense, right? I mean, if you're teaching kids, if you go to a vocational school instead of a school that, like an academic school that teaches math and science, then obviously your math and science scores in the standardized tests are gonna go down. Obviously, it makes sense. So it makes you wonder, like, well, why do we even have vocational schools to begin with? And there's good reasons for vocational schools. There's good reasons for AP classes. There's good reason for all of this. So we have to really weigh the pros and cons of tracking, which I do believe there are pros to it. It's the fundamental sort of tagline that I would use, that I derived from this book, is priorities. What are our real priorities? Do we prioritize teachers over kids? Do we prioritize math enough? Do we prioritize it too much? Do we prioritize, it really reflects our culture, our results really reflect our cultural values. So I'm done with it. Well, by the way, this is a side note. In parentheses, unrelated note, the educational minister in Poland said he strongly suggested that teachers are the most important part to fix education. And I do agree with that. The author of the book also discussed the differences between America and the rest of the world in terms of curriculum. So Finland had a defined national curriculum, which she said was a good thing. In the U.S., we don't. We have some states not even teaching evolution. Textbooks also have to appease thousands of school districts and states, covering each topic in too little depth. Minnesota improved its math scores, and when it improved their math ranking, they did it by having a specific math standard. That was like one of the first steps they took, was have a specific math standard. So, for example, here's an example: Americans end up learning about fractions every single year, while kids in other countries cover fractions only 4 years and they move on. She also obviously found a stark difference in our value of sports. Okay, she really talks poorly about the American emphasis and obsession we have with sports. Nowhere else in the world do they mix sports with education in schools so much. And I kind of agree with this. If we have limited amount of resources, right? And we need to prioritize these resources, then I would agree we need to jettison that, right? We should cut sports. And it's an appalling thought, because I love, high school memories from, sports. But she adds the international perspective, the fact that America is unique in this regard. Everyone else in the world thinks we're weird in, valuing sports so much. And sometimes education loses resources to sports. In the United States, we also overemphasize technology. Nowhere else in the world do schools spend so much money on technology. Of course, they spend they pay their teachers more money, but we're unmatched in terms of technology being used in the classroom, and a lot poorer countries perform a lot better without spending so much on technology. It's interesting. She also dedicated a section to talking about racial disparities. She had a chapter about how in Canada, for example, there is no gap between immigrant students and other students' performance. Singapore also has an extremely diverse country religiously and racially, and yet they also have no racial gaps in their learning. She attributes that to a historic authoritarian dictatorship that has made a lot of laws to prevent racism in public institutions. In the U.S., on the other hand, black kids and Mexican kids get a lot worse grades. It would seem black kids get the equivalent of 2 years less of schooling, but have attended school the same amount of years. Now, my personal opinion, which is obviously probably not shared by the author, but as a side note, I personally think that, as she mentioned, poor Korean how poor Korean families pay the price for hagwons? I think likewise, poor American families would prioritize schools, their kids' education. I know a lot of poor people who really prioritize education. And I think if everything was privatized, or if we had a voucher system, or stuff like that, I think that's my personal belief. I think that would be the case. poor people would privatize it and put their money to it. But that's my personal belief. It would not be, obviously, it would not be as much as how much rich people who start out rich can pay, but you'd be surprised. Education is definitely the biggest equalizer. So there was also a section about parent involvement. She mentioned that what works and what doesn't work for your kid to be successful in school. For example, getting involved in your kid's school, in their PTA and events may not have any impact. Talking to your kids about current events or reading to them, just reading to them, does have an impact, and a big one. And you know what the weird thing is? Just reading, not even reading to them, just you yourself reading, and them seeing you read is a big impact. Kids tend to work hard in school or slack off. This was her observation. Kids tend to slack off or work hard based on the kids who sit around them or the expectations of the adults around them. They really can sift through the lies that adults, because adults lie to children all the time. Well, adults lie to kids all the time. Kids can tell, and they will know if you're really taking it seriously, if you really hold them, what your real expectations are for them. This reminds me of something, I think it was from the Freakonomic guys, who mentioned that kids get certain habits from their parents, right? So they really get, if you smoke or drink, your kids will smoke and drink. How you treat waiters, your kids will treat waiters that way. And another one was, obviously, like, they found that kids who do well in college baseball, their dad also played college baseball. So what they said, what one of them, I think it was the Freakonomic guys, what they said was, if your kid didn't make the cut for the college baseball team, and you thought, was there anything I could have done more? The answer is yes. You could have been a professional baseball player or a college baseball player, and that would have increased your kid's chances of making that too. Kids really inherit a lot, and a big part of having a successful kid is being a successful parent yourself. They also talk about class sizes, right? As I talked about before, there's many countries like class sizes, surprisingly to me, they don't seem to have a lot of bearing. People always complain about class sizes, and it makes logical sense to me, but apparently there's a lot of poorer countries with bigger class sizes that are outperforming the United States. So the purpose of these videos or these recordings are basically to have a little sort of book club between me and you, the listener. So if you have anything to say, please add it to the comments, obviously. But there was, if we were in a book club, I would mention one little thing that I remember from the book, which is that, the author basically followed 3 kids from America who were foreign exchange students in those 3 countries, Poland, Finland, and South Korea. The kid who went to Poland had it's just an odd little thing. He had a goal to read, they were all very smart kids, very intellectual. And the kid who went to Poland had a goal to read 100 pages a day because he was really into literature. And it's one of those things. It's just weird. We all know he didn't make it. That's unsustainable. Nobody can read 100 pages. I wonder how long that lasted. And I'm not being a jerk about it, because we all have those unrealistic goals, but people who have those kinds of aspirations, they go far in life. That kid, and I'm sure that the author also wrote about it with that same sentiment. This kid has intellectual aspirations to read 100 pages of literature a day. It's not sustainable, but even if it really is, even if you shoot to the moon, you'll hit a star or whatever. So that was an interesting part. I wonder what came of that. I'm sure, if he didn't read 100 pages a day, I'm sure he reads a lot of books. So anyways, the other weird thing about the book that I would like to just bring up that has nothing to do with the substance or the material covered in it, it just seemed like the marketing was for new parents, That's what I thought. I kind of confused it with another book that I thought it was going to be about genius kids, the smartest kids. There's a Rubik's Cube in the cover. It kind of seemed like it was marketed to be like, hey, you want your kid to be a genius? Then read this book, right? So Smartest Kids. I think the title also kind of adds to it. Anywho, I hope you enjoyed this. I truly enjoyed that book. I highly recommend it. I will say that again. It's just a fun book. You learn a lot, and it makes you mad. It makes you mad reading the disparity between Finland and the reaction people have to change in the United States. But it's all good. I kind of held some punches. I would have gone full libertarian and really tried to defend, even though I did kind of defend the free market and the idea of privatizing everything. But I'm willing to compromise. If there's a Democrat next in power and they want to, they don't want to privatize education. I mean, what am I talking about even? Why are we even talking about? There's not going to be any changes. Let's be honest. But let's say hypothetically there is a Democrat in power. I'm willing to compromise as long as they fire all these incompetent teachers going through the public education system. What a failure that was. History could have been fun. Math could have been easy. It's just like, I'm sure that these teachers, they start out as idealistic and hopeful, and they're going to make a difference. But soon after, man, like clockwork, all the teachers just become complacent, and they start seeing the kids as failure. Because the kids are being built, it's failure upon failure. How can you help a kid who has ADD, So I would be totally fine with a new regulation, even though I, as a libertarian, hate regulation, but a new regulation saying, hey, fire, 2/3 of the crappy teachers and only keep 1/3. God knows we can afford them. We have a huge surplus. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this, and please subscribe. Read that book. Please subscribe also. If the next book I'm going to talk about is called Embattled Rebel. It's about Jefferson Davis. And there's another book that got me really heated and angry, because you're yelling, just like you're yelling here at all these school administrators. You're yelling at all the incompetence that the Southern generals had. So if you want to see my review and highlights from that book, please subscribe. Thank you.